This report was produced by a team of analysts working with the SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, a private group of scientists, military analysts, and investigators. It's a comprehensive review of thermal, visual, and sensor data related to an unusual series of events in and around the Aguadilla, Puerto Rico airport in April 2013. Rich Hoffman, one of the co-founders of SCU, a 26-year systems analyst for the U.S. Army, says the case information and thermal images originated with a pilot who works for the Department of Homeland Security.
And apparently they had attempted to go and to take the video that they had captured of this strange object and this experience, and they tried to pass it up their food chain, if you would, up to Homeland Security. Well, Homeland Security said, well, we don't look into this stuff. You pass it down. They also attempted to go up to the Air Force Intelligence, and Air Force Intelligence said, well, we don't do anything with UFOs anymore or whatever like that. So bottom line was that the pilots down there said, well, we can pretty much go anywhere with this, right? And in fact, they were encouraged to go to maybe a UFO organization. Well, that's kind of like how it then got passed up to Miami. But there was a stipulation. They wanted to make sure that we do not really represent, they wanted scientists who are knowledgeable about UFOs, but not necessarily that we take it through MUFON channels. They wanted to be scientifically looked at, not UFO related, because again, the stigma that goes along with UFOs, right?
Right.
So we pulled a team together, and that's those names I mentioned, and we just got together and said, well, we're gonna, what do you want us to do? Sign NDAs? And yep. And by the way, they had done background checks on us to actually see that we could actually come in and work on this very well. And we passed that, and we basically honored the fact that we're not going to talk about the witness's name, and we're not going to give that, but we wanted to do this scientifically. So we spent 2 consecutive years analyzing 7,027 frames of a 3-minute and 54-second video from that Aguadilla case. And we were going like down to the pixel level, looking to see if we could make out any kinds of determinations. And in that experience, you had to also factor out the fact that the parallax effect, because now what you've got is an object that's rotating around an airplane. So you've got that kind of like pinwheel or that kind of thing going on. And so we had to take that into consideration. And we tried to look at everything from the thermal aspects of the camera. I was able to identify, because I'm in the DoD, that was L3 was the camera. It was a Westcam camera. And I was able to get model information and all that stuff. Another person was focusing on the water transit scene. And can we determine speeds of it moving through the water? And did it really go into the water? Did it make a splash when it went in? And we were looking at pixels to see if we could see splash indicators. And we also saw it in moving underneath the water. We said, well, what's that about? How do you have an object that's below water showing this in thermal? Well, the thing is, if you think of, there's a thing called a Bernoulli hump that you experience where the water, it's moving underwater, it's displacing the water around it, and you now get a rise, and that change in temperature would allow you to be able to factor out that, well, okay, that's what the object is doing. It's moving underwater. It's actually displacing the water on the top, and it's changing the temperature, and that's what you're seeing, a ghost thing. So we literally tore that whole thing apart many, many ways, looked at it multiple thousands of times, and produced our report.
The SCU team put together animation which shows the sequence of events. Unknown objects were seen off and on, both visually and on radar, blips and lights that appeared, disappeared, and appeared again in different spots, just beyond the airport runway. The white objects on the screen are ones which were detected on radar, but which had no transponder signals associated with a known aircraft. A Department of Homeland Security plane was preparing to take off.
Why don't you describe the sequence of events that are shown on the film for those who don't know?
No problem. So let me tell you the story. Back up here. It's about 9:00 in the evening. It's completely pitch dark, and this is in April, so it's still pitch dark, and this is in Puerto Rico, and a Dash 8 aircraft loaded with 4 different people on board. It's a crew of 4. You have a pilot, co-pilot, you have a radar operator, and you also have a camera operator that are sitting in the back. And they're off on a drug smuggling mission. You know, that's what Homeland Security does. There's a lot of activity with that kind of thing down in Puerto Rico. And so ultimately, they're taking off from the Rafael Hernandez Airport, and they're going from the airport kind of goes from a southwest to a northeast. So when you're taking off, you're going directly into that wind that I talked about, right? So it was about 9 o'clock in the evening. There's a full moon, and there are about 50 hits of radar out in the water just to the north, a little bit more to the west of that airport, just offshore. And there's these 50 hits of this object that's doing some incredible changing and maneuvers, and in and of itself is pretty wild. And then you've got about 9:16 or so, this plane is now taking off, and it's starting to gain, it's got cleared for takeoff. It's now up at just maybe about 400 feet or so. The pilots are now looking over, and they're seeing a light, a pinkish white light that is now coming in from the ocean and toward the airport. And it's going to be right in the flight path that they're going to go off on. And so they contacted the tower and said, I thought you had us cleared for takeoff, and what is this? And they said that they saw the light as well from the control tower. So the crew decided that they would fly around it in a big circle. And so they started flying counterclockwise in a circle around the airport, and they were watching this thing. Well, the light then goes off. And they thought, well, okay, this could be drug smugglers, because that's one of the things that they do. They turn off their lights and they drop their drugs or whatever they're going to do. And so they kept going around. And so when they get to about the same area where they actually took off of, when it went dark, the pilot contacted behind him the camera operator and said, turn on the thermal and let's record this. So now you got that camera operator who is now turning on his camera, and he's attempting to find that object. He finds the object and he starts to track it, and he's manually moving that around to be able to keep that in line. And so here's this object that is now coming in, and if you've ever seen in thermal ranges, it looks like daylight on the actual images of the video, but completely it's pitch black. Other than the fact you have a full moon behind you, it's pitch black. Okay, so there might be a little bit of shadow and stuff like that, but it's very, very dark. So they watch this object on their screens as they're flying their plane in this circle, if you would, and they go around for the second time now. They've gone around once, they now go around for the second time, and then they start heading south towards and going on their mission, because they couldn't just keep doing this. They needed to go off. But by this time, the object appears that it goes around the airport. And in fact, the control tower stopped a FedEx plane from taking off. It was sitting there on the runway, and you see it in the video clip. It's sitting there. And it didn't get to take off until a lot later, so it was departing late. And then you see this object then swing back, and it comes up across the runway, or appears to come across the runway, and then it goes in, like you see a supermarket that's in the background, and then it starts to get lower in terms of its altitude, and it's now getting down towards the shore, and you see it in the water, and it's coming in, and it did almost like a full circle from the spot where it came in, and it's now going back to that same spot. And then you look at it, and you'll see that the object appears to go into the water. You lose sight of it on its thermal, and you then see like this white thing on the top of the water, and it's moving along. And then the next thing you see is the object appears to come up out of the water, and it's as dark as it was when it went in. And by the way, in thermal, black is hot and white is cold on this setting that they had on that camera. And so then it comes up and gets really, really dark. And then you see it split into two separate objects. And when you see that split, you're going like, what did I just look at, you know? And that's what they were doing. And the one object that was behind that split off of it, and then you see it kind of like go into the water and disappears. And the other one kind of hangs up for a minute, and it slowed its speed down, and then it goes into the water. And so that's kind of like the gist of what happened. They went on their flight mission, did their drug smuggling run, whatever they did. They got back to the airport, and they said, well, what did we just see? Scratching their heads. They were able to get a USB or something like that in there and somehow download it. And then what do we do with it from here? And that's kind of like the story of that. And we cover it in greater detail, of course. And there were other witnesses, by the way, ground. Then you had the control tower, and who also saw it. And one pilot was coming into work, and he was like seeing it in the sky. And so anyway, that's the story, George.
Since the SCU first published its report in 2015, alternate theories have been proposed. UFO debunkers allege the object was a Chinese lantern sent aloft by a nearby hotel. Two other, more detailed analyses propose that a mylar balloon could explain some of what is seen in the thermal images. Hoffman and his colleagues published detailed responses to the critics, arguing that any counter theory must explain the full sequence of events, not just bits and pieces. Can balloons do what these objects did?
So, Rich, this craft, it's doing these incredible maneuvers. It enters and exits the water. It splits into two. It goes dark. This suggests it's not a balloon. It's not birds. It's not any aircraft. That leaves you kind of in a category of unknown, right?
It does. And George, we even went to the point of like looking to find out whether that there are any drones that are capable of doing this. And we did do some research, and the Navy had been experimenting on things like there was one that we found that was called the Flimmer. And bottom line on it was it's more like a drone that has wings to it, and it's got the fuselage, the long fuselage to it. And then what happens is it goes into the water. The wings come apart, and it acts more like a torpedo. But it doesn't come out on the other end and then pop up in the air, right? And it doesn't split into two. So again, you go through this like logic trail to be able to make sense of this. We calculated the speed varied in everywhere from like roughly around 80 to 85 miles an hour and higher. When it hit the water, it was about 109 miles per hour. Even when it was underneath the water, it was traversing across at about an 80 mile an hour clip, and it varied. And then eventually it kind of slows down a little bit. It was down, I think it got down to about 40 miles per hour. And then you see it just barely moving when it comes out of the water. So, and, we literally were measuring speeds, and then we'd have to be able to deduct the aircraft speed from that, to be able to figure that out. There were certain parts when the video, we could actually make matches, and we could actually see that the object went behind a telephone pole, which allowed us to then deduce this, the size of the pole and compare that to the object. And we actually got a distance on there, and we were able to then deduce that it was roughly about 3 to 5 feet in diameter. Was all the bigger that it was.
So if you hit the water going 109 miles an hour, we don't have a lot of craft that can do that and not break apart, I would think.
Yeah, well, precisely.
Hoffman compared the Aguadilla UFO to the now famous Tic Tac incident, a 2004 encounter off the coast of Southern California involving the USS Nimitz carrier group. SCU produced a detailed analysis of that incident as well, a paper included on the group's website.
And that's the same kind of thing when you put this in the scenario of even the Nimitz case, right? Take a look at that. The object was seen to be not being impacted by the air at all. I mean, these things have always never been impacted by air. You don't hear sonic booms when they take off. They can have these unusual shapes to them, like squares and cubes, and apparently go at these incredible speeds. So apparently our atmosphere, these things are not structured, or they somehow manipulate space around them in some such way that, including water, to be able to go underneath the water and to do what they do and hardly leave a track. And so, the objects that you would experience and reported back in the 50s are very much like the Tic Tacs today. They're not doing anything different. Those 5 observables that Lou talks about, those things have been around through history. And in fact, he was on a show last night with, discussing this with, was that Fade to Black?
Radio
show?
guy. Yeah.
Yeah, a radio guy. Anyway, he was talking about, Lou was talking about last night, and he was like mentioning, well, if you go back into like Wonders in the Sky, the book by Jacques Vallée.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's covering, these things are doing the same thing back then in the recording that they are here now. And so anyway, okay, should we be surprised that it can move under the water like it did? And yeah, no, we shouldn't be. They've been doing it all along. And do they? So there you go.
Again, the lesson I think from that Aguadilla case, as with Tic Tac, is there is evidence that can be studied by scientists if they are inclined to go ahead and take a look at it.
Correct. And we should be doing that anyway. I mean, because regardless of whether there's some sort of an explanation down the road for this that's natural and prosaic, and somebody can come up with a magical explanation for it, we accept that. We just would like to see them, do the due diligence and not focus on, many of the people that have written papers have been attacking us on the parallax issue, which we've already announced that, and they're claiming it's a balloon. And we say, well, wait a minute, have you looked at it in thermal? How do you explain the splitting of the balloons? And they don't look at the whole picture. They'll focus on one issue. And we say that that's not doing your science justice, okay? You have to look at all the facts. You can't pick and choose what you want to go into and do.
The Aguadilla case, I want you to describe, for those who are not familiar with it, what evidence you were analyzing and what conclusions you came to. And that paper is on the SCU website, by the way.
It is.
And then,
and the video.
Discuss it in the context of there is stuff to study. Scientists and scientifically minded people can study this if they want to. Not every case, not every UFO sighting can be studied to that degree, but some can. And there is evidence that can be analyzed. And this paper that you developed proves it.
Yeah, the significance of that particular video for us, George, is, and as we compare that to all the many thousands of things that are reported and sent up into MUFON. I mean, most of those are like an iPhone, or some sort of like movie camera or whatever like that. But it's taken by not necessarily many of them are just like lens flares and not photographers. On the Aguadilla case, you were talking about something that was actually in the thermal ranges of the spectrum, beyond the visible. So now you're starting to say, well, I'm looking in a different thing that I can't normally see. And so it was important that way. Number two, it's taken with a military grade camera, and this Westcam camera. And so that was a rarity, coupled with the fact that you had that, again, thermal range. And so, and with all that wonderful metadata, if you've seen the video, it's like the FLIR and like the gimbal and all those, where you have metadata on the screens that tells you where the aircraft's location is in a GPS nature. It tells you its flight speed or its altitude. And those are the things that you really want to be able to get to study, that you don't get from somebody that's using their iPhone camera to take a picture of a light at night, which is not going to give you anything to go on. It's just, and so the fact that we had thermal, we could actually see the actual object of it and where its temperature deviated, because basically your thermal is looking at what they call temperature contrast. And the camera itself can actually detect, and this is how sensitive those cameras are, 1/100th of a degree difference in temperature. That's how precise these things are. So, I mean, with that, all that stuff combined, and after the God knows, the 56 years that I've been engaged in this, I had never seen a video like that before. I mean, it's rare that we ever get anything with, again, the metadata there and that kind of information. And so we all decided 2 years is just, we're going to spend as long as it takes to be able to do that.
So what's the conclusion? What was it?
We said, well, what could it logically be? Well, what flies like this? What splits into two? What has this color temperature or this temperature range that we're talking about? Obviously, we looked at it, and there's one, the beginning of it, it looks like it's a tumbling balloon. But you don't know, and that's how we look at it in the visual range. In the thermal range, it could be completely different. That could be the temperature changing around it. Did it look like it had any kind of an indication of a propulsion system? Because guess what? The wind speeds at the altitude that this thing was everywhere from like 15 to 18 miles an hour, heading from the northeast to the southwest, right? And this object was moving around and into the wind. Okay, well, looking again for propulsion, didn't see any propulsion systems on it. And then we said, could it be a balloon? And what does a balloon look like in thermal? And we actually have a friend of ours we reached out to, Dave Fulch, who was as a FLIR technician, and he even had the Westcam camera, and he went out and literally took pictures of a balloon, a Mylar balloon type thing, and what it looked like in just a very small, like 4 mile per hour wind, and he had it tied down, and this thing was going like crazy every which direction, and the thermal match was not there at all. Okay, well, so that wasn't it. And by the way, have you ever heard of a balloon splitting? No. Well, and you get where I'm going, right? So we then said, well, could it be a bird? Well, let's go look at we have pictures of birds in thermal. Well, it doesn't match up, So you keep going down the list of all the things that could potentially be. And number one thing is that, how many things split into 2 identical pieces?
The SCU analysis of the Aguadilla UFO, including animation based on authentic radar data and the original thermal images provided by Homeland Security, can be accessed on the SCU website, along with rival analyses. George Knapp reporting for Mystery Wire.